You're very welcome to another episode of the Scaling Your Business podcast. For this episode, delighted to be joined by Leonard Donnelly, the CEO of Waylay. Leonard, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Rian. Delighted to be here.
And I'm delighted to have you. Leonard, typical fashion of the show is we start with early influences, 5-6 minutes getting to know you, maybe a little less, and then we go into all the good stuff. So no different with you. I know you went and studied at both DIT at Trinity and Trinity, numerous degrees. I couldn't find out exactly where you grew up. So can you put me out of my misery? And then I have a couple of questions based on that.
Yeah, a bit of a traveller. So born in Monaghan, lived in I think till about 7 or 8, I can't remember, in Blackrock outside Dundalk, and then moved to Greystones in County Wicklow. And so that's Greystones is effectively where I grew up. But I did live in Bray for a year, and I went to Presentation College Bray for my primary era, and yeah, that's a little bit of background.
So out of all that travel, other than packing up boxes, have you got any favorite standout memories, maybe hobbies that you enjoyed while growing up?
Yeah, no, I was a prolific golfer. I would like to think I was very good. My mother, who's 87, is still winning golf competitions, so that
Wow.
gives a sense of her gifts, maybe not mine. So I did an awful lot of sailing, and naturally in Greystones, we had a club there all the time, so sailed an awful lot. In fact, won a few national races, this is going way back, a long time ago. And other hobbies, yeah, I'm actually, when I was young, I was kind of a bit of a strange individual in that I collected antique bottles. So I would basically go into places, from other people's gardens, and whatnot, without them knowing, and I would know where to find, kind of these sort of bottles that would date back to maybe these 1700s, and obviously
Wow.
further up to Victorian times. And so that actually became that was my kind of first entree into trading, because I began to realize that there was an interest in these bottles commercially, and it also was quite catalytic in as much as my friends saw that I was earning money, by selling these in markets, and they would be quite enthusiastically now going bottle digging, and earning a few quid as well. So that was it's probably my first hobby that became a sort of a business interest.
Well, you mentioned bottle digging and nothing like that, but my granddad has a boat that he hasn't, it's the bottom of his garden in Kilkenny. He hasn't taken it out in like 25 years. And one day I took off the cover, I went inside it, and he said the last time he took it out was 1987, and there was Coke bottles from 1987 inside of it that hadn't seen the light of day since, which was
Wow.
strange to see Coke bottles older than me because I'm 93. Um, you mentioned your mother. I don't want to put an answer in your head. I'm just bringing this up because you mentioned her. But I like to ask guests around the topic of impact and influence.
Mm.
What I mean by that is that if you dial back the years, maybe, when you were a teenager, people can usually pinpoint a small handful of people, acquaintances, close friends, teachers, parents who had a massive impact on who they turned out to be today. Does
Yeah.
anyone, 2 or 3 people spring to mind for you? And if so, who are they?
Yeah, my grandmother on my mother's side first, and that's not to say there's anything wrong with my other grandmother. Just didn't really have as much contact.
Mm.
My mother would have been. She's a very forceful individual, and she's a very fair-minded individual, and so kind of equality and a parity of esteem, would have been something that I would have picked up. My father's a very well, he's long past, but I guess he, not only a very creative person, but also a very numerate person, so therefore I must have carried something, through from my father, and quite an astute individual, as well. So I guess those 3 people come to mind. I think a history teacher in school, like history was a huge passion of mine. And I think, I think I learned from, being, incredibly motivated around a subject, that I had a deep interest in. Then I began to understand the value of teaching and what the difference was between good and bad teaching. And then I'd like to think in the way that I communicate with people, that I'd like to think I'm an engaging person, that it's interesting to, the way that I kind of build a relationship with another human being, the way that I can make whatever we're talking about kind of topical relevant, using good metaphors, to kind of explain complex things. And so, but I think that I can channel all that back to maybe this very interesting history teacher.
Wow. Well, shout out to your history teacher, your grandmother, both your parents, and also your son Adam, or Callum, sorry,
Oh, yes.
as well.
Yeah.
I'd like to rewind. Go on.
And my other sons, Eric and
yeah. So I just referenced Callum because he was one of the guys that got this conversation flowing, but I'm not going to diss any of your other sons or daughters either. I'd like to rewind the clock to 1992 from your time at Force Systems. You spent 7 years there. If you see my eyes moving to the right, I'm reading some of the screen. During your time there, the company grew rapidly. The company was awarded the 1998 Irish Software Industry Award, and you held a number of, let's say, key positions. Towards the latter part of your time there, and this is probably asking you to rewind the clock just like you did a minute or two ago, what's one or two things that you felt that you did right that contributed to the success and eventual sale of that company?
Okay. Well, the company name was actually Heuristics, but Heuristics was acquired by Force Systems.
Gotcha.
So it was a little bit of context. When I was doing my Trinity Management Science degree, we had a final year dissertation, which is probably the most important thing in that study. And I got a first class honors, which is great.
Congrats.
And I kind of often wondered why, because everybody has a value when they produce new research. But I think the reason that I did so well on that was I looked at the Irish software industry, and we had in the 80s there was a pattern that a company, and some of the more prominent ones, would grow to about 100 people and then they'd fall over, they'd fail very fast. So I came up with the theory that the personality of the CEO, it will fundamentally, if you can actually understand them and even psychometrically understand the human being that is running a knowledge-intensive company, that you can understand the way that they're going to behave, and you can actually predict whether they're going to structure the company proactively in an aggressive way. And you can trace these things back to the nature of the person. So I did that study, and I came up with a predictive model for business failure success, or somewhere in the middle, and it was very, very accurate. And so the three things that were going to be winners based on the personality of the CEO transpired to be. They're all thought very, very well. The failures were very easy to predict. There's some spectacular ones, enormous amounts of money, even for the 1980s. And then there were lots of them in the middle. So that was my grounding, to get interested in the software industry. So one of the personalities that I met in that, I think I interviewed 24 CEOs over about a 6.5 hour period, all recorded on old, old tape machines and whatnot. He was a very interesting character, was CEO of a company that should have been incredibly successful. And the one thing you learn actually very early on, when you look a little bit beyond that, is that the company governance, from the role of founders and chairs and personalities in companies can either make a company functioning or dysfunctioning. And so I think he experienced a dysfunctioning reality. So he had started a small consulting company in the area of telecoms, because that was the background of the two founders. And I just by happenstance took an interest in the company and was curious to see, did they want to be a software development company? Did they want to be a product development company? And so had that engagement. I think I did 5 interviews for the job. And the reason actually, I think, had more to do with the fact that they had no money. They couldn't afford a salary. But the long and the short of it is, it was good actually, because I kind of pre-baked, it was a very, very small consulting thing. So I kind of pre-baked what it is I was going to do, been very, very thoroughly. So one key decision we made, and maybe, being young and being a student in the States, I kind of looked at Europe and I said, oh my God, it's a kill zone for us. it will never really be a successful software company selling to Europe at the time, because in telecoms deregulation hadn't occurred. You had big public monolithic entities. So Telecom would be in BT, or France Telecom, etc., etc. So what we did was, and what I did is basically got on the plane on my own initially, with a little bit of support from the CTO and maybe an engineer or two, but pretty quickly we started winning accounts based on the premise that the big telecom companies had been broken up in the States. That kind of ushered in the age of the internet. It ushered in an awful lot of innovation. So you had this miraculous kind of explosion of new companies that were building, telecommunication networks in a new way. And then from a software perspective, they had big gaps, both in signaling systems, particularly when they were looking at Europe. And then also they had never even thought, okay, we've built all these sophisticated pieces of equipment. How do we actually manage them? So, cut a long story short, we did incredibly well picking up those deals very fast. I remember coming home once with a PO for $1.5 million. There was kind of just astonishment, and this is in the early days of the company. And then deals started coming sort of hot and fast after that. We were operating in a little farm, and above a pharmacy in Stillorgan, we eventually kind of exhausted that building, and then we moved to bought a building in Dunleary, and then all of a sudden, before we knew it, we had become, in Irish terms, a very big company, and we'd really done incredibly well, not only just in North America. We were now acquiring customers kind of in Europe and in other parts of the world. But at that point, I think that our timing was good. We had great strategic interest in the company, and so it was either going to be Four Systems, the company that bought us, or it was going to be Telabs or Marconi or a few other people. And I knew that anyway, because I'm kind of incredibly close to the customers, particularly on the product side, which was Raceman. And we knew that it had high value in the way that the telecoms market was beginning to kind of bubble, if you like. And naturally, it actually happened.
Wow. You mentioned your dissertation at the very start when you started talking there, and how you had talked about when companies reach the cap of about 100 people, something just seems to go wrong. I heard the CEO of Gong.io, Amit, I can't remember his second name. He said that he found, because he's built a few companies to like the 400-500 number, and he says when it gets to about 120 to 150 people, the communication line seems to break, and it's an entirely different problem you've got to solve then. But that's not my question. My question is, taking your thesis or dissertation aside, you've been an advisor and investor in some companies along the way throughout your career. And something that I've mentioned on this podcast before is a book. Unfortunately, I can't reach it right now, but it's around these blind spots that otherwise healthy businesses can fall victim to. Things like improperly onboarding people, not creating a culture of accountability, failing to tie corporate goals to personal goals. You get the picture, not focusing on lead generation. So when you look at the startup world, or like medium-sized companies, I know that's two different size companies. When you look at that world in 2021, are there common blind spots that you see reoccurring again and again and again, that if the company kind of got themselves together and overcame that, their revenue could be double, triple, quadruple what it currently is?
I'll answer you asked two questions, one big question and then the tail end of another question, which was getting to 100 people. The key thing to do if you're at that 100, 120 people thing to do is why companies don't actually, why some companies find a terrible adjustment is actually because they don't train leaders to actually take on the fact that things are scaling up. You have just to kind of break up teams. You have to have more teams, but you have to have leaders. But those leaders have to be picked carefully and they have to be trained. So a good company will do that. And a company that will struggle will miss that. And so that's a fundamental reason that certain companies go on and grow fast. Usually it's because the overall capability, has been predicted and adjusted for. So that's to the first one. The second question is a really, really big one. I'd like to maybe kind of break it down a bit.
Sure.
Are we assuming that most of these companies are we talking generically all small companies, or are we talking technology?
Let's say like Series B tech company onward, Series B, Series C kind of tech company.
Okay, so so Series B from a funding perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't deem them necessarily to be startup. I think there'd be more scale-ups.
Okay.
Okay. So a lot of companies get defocused. So when a company gets to that Series B stage and they're beginning to scale up, keeping your core product development activity kind of focused and streamlined around where most of your revenue is going to come from is something. It seems really simple, but a lot of companies go astray because they've picked up bits and pieces of business, or they're finding new things. But the problem is that all these new things that they're finding don't necessarily interfere, and create confusion in relation to what the primary purpose and the primary revenue generating vehicle of the company is. That is a very, very common problem. And again, it gets down to the leadership, in the company, to making sure that you don't get bent off course. Even with our great company Waylay, I mean, it's so seductive. I mean, there's opportunity everywhere. We can go left and right. We can do we can automate absolutely everything in the world. But for our stage of development, it's really important that we stay focused around the core things that we need to consolidate and win. And then you broaden out and you win more, and then we're in a more controlled organizational development phase. So that I think under the underlying thing in every company is that I think marketing is absolutely everything. So there are companies that are market in a very poor way. There are companies that have the people in a small enterprise or smallish enterprise should actually be very free and creative and asymmetrical in relation to how they actually promote their business. The reason for that is actually very, very simple, because you will always be put in a class in a sector, within a sector, a category, and you'll always be benchmarked off something else. Now, if your approach to being small and supposedly having a USP and being innovative, if you take the exact same marketing approach that your bigger things that you compete with adopt, where is the value for your company? Where is the differentiation? Where is the personality of the company? Because again, people are not, let's say particularly in software, people are not just buying technology that gets plugged in to go on. The buyers understand that there's the culture of the company and its sincerity in relation to how the customers are going to be supported, whether the people are happy at work. All these kind of things in a modern way are very, very important. I'll pause there because I could just go on and on in different ways.
No, it's fascinating. I'm just thinking when you mentioned the leadership side of things, it's interesting that you say that, because there's a number of companies out there that do a lot of training, but there's very few that do training for leadership. And I don't know whether that's because the companies themselves just don't invest in the leaders. But I saw I've heard a number of people say that one of the worst things you can do is to promote the best individual contributor to a leadership role just because they're the best individual contributor does not necessarily mean that they're going to be the best leader. I'm assuming, based on what you've said over the last 5 minutes, that you're in agreement with that.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And also you find that the best individual contributors tend to be that way because their world is decluttered. Because they're not carrying all this responsibility from running teams, which is not necessarily core to their DNA. And that's a very, very common mistake. It's a very common mistake. A lot of companies that are growing fast, sometimes you have to make that mistake, you know, in places, because you're going so fast, you've got no choice. But you need to be very, very conscious of the fact, and you need to communicate with that person in you know, explaining exactly what you're doing, explaining the tactical nature of the change, but explaining that you're going to make the adjustment, and they will be able to revert to type. So that's kind of probably a better reflection of the real world.
You were the CEO of Waylay. Rather than me attempt the 30 or 60-second commercial, you'll do a much better job. So, Leonard, the mic is yours.
So I think I'm still the CEO of Waylay. I think you said I was, but that's neither here nor there.
Apologies.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I mean, let me give you an example, okay? And it's very interesting from a startup point of view. And again, I'm sorry for the audience here if I'm concentrating too much on technology, but you've all this money that kind of goes into companies that are either doing something, let's imagine it in the IoT space, and very, very relevant to climate change and all the innovation that's going to come next. And or let's imagine companies that are doing things in a SaaS business model where they have to work with different data types. All these, you know, I know this as an investor as well. Founders of companies like this tend to constantly keep building software in the middle of their enterprise, that, you know, they should never write in the first place. So they're not concentrating on where they add value. So what's innovative about Waylay as a company is we automate the different, you could call it the operations technology world with the IT world, or the AI world with the operations technology world, or the data world, data to data world. We've got different systems. And what we've done is built what probably is definitely the most sophisticated automation engine on the planet. And what we do for small companies, we have an accelerate program. We just say, guys, you know, even my son would agree with me on this one. Looking back in his own first startup, you know, don't invent software that you can buy a much more sophisticated solution which just slips into your world. You don't have to change anything. And you get the opportunity to add value, you know, particularly around, let's say, on water leak. You know, so if you had an IoT use case where you built a very interesting flow meter or water leakage kind of detection system, you know, focus all the effort on the customer side, the AI, the algorithms that you need to build, rather than doing the automation, which is at the Ferrari end. You know, because you have to build a Ferrari engine to do anything at scale. So at the upper end of what we do, I mean, we have huge customers. The biggest oil and gas energy company in the world is one of our customers. You know, so they would have thousands of different products and systems in the field. And in that scenario, they would be a company that, a bit like a startup, they tried to build all this kind of very clever automation software themselves. Then they kind of gave up on that, and then you know, went to Azure and AWS and even Alibaba in China and said, can you guys figure out how to do this thing in the middle? And they all failed. We're a company that has, you know, been very astute in that we've understood how you need to build that automation engine to make everything work. Because what you're doing is you're automating millions and millions of assets in the field in real time. You know, everything is done on a time series database basis. You know, so that, you know, to do that, it actually means you are building a Ferrari engine. And so therefore, if you're in the oil and gas industry, why are you building engines? It's a bit like Boeing. Boeing doesn't build engines. It goes to Pratt and Whitney and Rolls Royce. So that's, you know, so in the automation industry, we're the Rolls Royce or the Ferrari approach. We've slimmed our product down for the small startup-y scenarios, and then we also, for huge scale companies, you know, we do that as well. We've just landed a massive US industrial, I can only class them as an industrial company. But again, the same principles apply, the same experience of that other customer in the oil and gas industry where they've tried to do it all themselves. They just get to a point of total exhaustion because it's really tough. and we've been at it a long time. So company's still small, but it's kind of prospects for growth are pretty spectacular.
I'll leave links to the company website down below, whether you're listening or watching this, and also to your LinkedIn account as well. And I'll mention that again before we wrap up. But a couple more questions before we do wrap up. Is there a tool that you, as a CEO, can't live without?
A tool.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pondering on this because I use so many different tools. I'm just trying to think of the one that I'm.
CRM tool, maybe Slack as a communication to communicate with your team, Zoom for meetings. That's just a kind of a basic level version.
Probably Zoom. I mean, I use everything. I mean, I don't just use Zoom. I use Microsoft Teams. I use Google Meet. You name it. Zoom included. Realistically, I think that we'll never go back to the way that we have been. Even though I'm kind of back traveling to Ghent and things like that. I think when I look at the amount of travel that I've done in my life, I think that for example, 2018, I did 20 trips to San Francisco. And then trips to China on top of that, and then a few local trips in Europe, So that's just insane. You know what I mean? So that is never going to be repeated. It's not necessary. So therefore, this form of communication has worked brilliantly through the pandemic. The other thing that I think is important as well, and it goes back to a little bit of moral responsibility in relation to your carbon footprint, is building dependable teams in the regions. So, for example, we've hired really experienced people in the US, and so therefore, like, I want to build dependable teams. We don't have to have our co-founder and CTO constantly on a flight to Japan or Europe or China, and the same for me. And so what I want to build is dependability into the organization. So therefore, every single thing that we do as a company is actually has been transformed. Well, it always was. It was always using Skype, but I think just in an orchestrated way. I think that's important. Fundraising with investors, it's been the best thing ever, because I think I'm talking about 150 VCs around the world at the moment. And like, if you were to do that on the basis of doing it the traditional way, which is and kind of constantly kind of traveling, meeting people, you wouldn't be able to cover that amount of interesting people to kind of see, can you build a relationship with? So that's a big gain. The secondary one would be Slack. I think it's an incredibly useful tool. It's just on that borderline as well from not being too invasive. So I for example, I dislike using things like, I use things like WhatsApp, but more in a family private context.
Gotcha.
I dislike the idea that I would open up that world into commercial life. But I find Slack, it doesn't really matter whether it's internal or with with external customers and partners and investors. I find that great.
Two more questions for you. Second last one is, have you, and this is putting you on the spot here, have you got a personal definition of what success means to you?
Being happy. I think even I'm a little bit older than the average tech entrepreneur in today's world, but I don't know. I think that being happy thing is a passion, and so therefore I only would do this job in Waylay because I actually love and believe what we're doing. And that sounds a little bit cliched, but it's actually true, because I find what we're doing fascinating. And so if I'm not fascinated as an individual, I'm not happy. And so therefore, I think the context of your question was in a work context. So, I don't think I'm also ever the type of person that could possibly retire. I mean? I kind of a curious character. Maybe it goes back to the bottle digging, but where I live, I'm inclined to kind of build walls. Anyway, you would need to understand where I live, but I'm kind of, most people just wouldn't do the things that I do, and so therefore, I'm kind of on a personal level, I've got this interesting life, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then at a work level, I think I'm just intrinsically interested in things that absolutely I find fascinating. I'm very, very competitive. So winning is everything. Losing is very painful. And I don't worry, I've had some losses too. Anyway, so I'll stop there, you know, to answer your question.
So the final question to wrap this up, Leonard, is if you were the decision maker in adding a new mandatory subject to the secondary school curriculum, what would it be and why?
This question I wish I had actually prepared for a little bit better. So a mandatory subject. Well, I mean, I think the obvious one is, you know, computer science, but I think I would say it the wrong way. Look, everything that we do is low and no code based. Okay. So I think so many people in the educational system have been disenfranchised here from, you know, that they have to have great math skills, to actually to find a route to doing something computer science. Everything about Waylay as a company, which I'm very proud of, is the exact opposite. We're not debunking science, but we're democratizing, the whole problem domain of actually building applications. So what we do is, to give you an analogy, my mother, as I mentioned earlier, is 87. She can, with Waylay, design, build, operate, and maintain a nuclear power plant, technically, based on the tools that we give people. So imagine this: with us, you take delivery of a Ferrari engine. You drop it into your domain, and you've only got 5% of the work to actually complete something. So if you take some of the really sophisticated oil and gas installations I talked about, if they write 200 lines of code with our solution, that's really, really unusual. So you're talking about systems that traditionally you might have had millions of lines of code. That era is gone, but it's just simple, right? It's a drag and drop world. Okay, so what's important about that? And maybe creativity is the other thing that should be made mandatory in the education system. It's not encouraged. But now, because the world is these low and no code drag and drop tools, okay, what you're looking for is the curious human being, and actually how they think about problem solving, and actually how they can take their domain knowledge that has been either relevant as a teenager because they've become fixated on something, and then give them the tools to actually go build something. Or you could have somebody who's 30, 40 years, has built up deep knowledge on something. It could be a CNC milling machine or something like that. And what you're doing is you're now changing the world because you're allowing these people to actually build things based on what they know. That's massive in terms of change. So I'm not saying computer science, I would say take a leapfrog. And we're doing this with universities and some of the schools in Europe, where we're actually they're actually putting on their curriculum low and no code software building projects, where the kids don't actually have to have a high IQ for maths, but what they do have to have is curiosity, imagination, and creativity.
That's an interesting answer. Leonard, we're going to leave it there. Appreciate your time today. It's been fascinating spending the last 30 minutes with you. As mentioned before, I'll leave links to company website and your LinkedIn page below where people are listening or watching to this. But for today, thanks again for being my guest, Leonard.
No problem. Real pleasure, Rian. Take care.